as you might have guessed from my title, I teach history here at Purdue. And when I tell people that, I usually get one of two reactions. Sometimes I get, ugh, I hate history. It's so boring. Nothing but names and dates. How do you remember all that? On the other hand, sometimes I get this really enthusiastic, oh, I love history. I watch the History Channel all the time. I just saw this great documentary about how US B-52 bombers' superiority over German Messerschmitts is the reason we won World War II. So, I don't really agree with either perception of history. For me, historical instruction is not just about the chronological recitation of facts or the memorization of names and dates, but it's also not just what's on the History Channel. Although lately it seems to be nothing but shows about swamps and pawn shops. So basically, I think there's more to history than wars and white guys. And don't get me wrong, military and political history are very important, but my research priorities are social history and cultural history and gender history and environmental history. So when it came time for me to design my own history course, I had to figure out, how was I going to teach students about all these big, important national and international events, but at the same time to tell the stories of average people, and to explain broad cultural trends that are not easily reduced to one historic moment. So at the same time I was designing my syllabus, my significant other was working as a reporter for a local newspaper. And he used to get so excited when his stories were published above the fold on the front page. And these would typically be stories about city council meetings or school board meetings or new zoning ordinances. And to be honest, they were kind of dull. My favorite part of the paper was this column that was way in the back. And it was written by this local guy who was kind of crazy. But in all honesty, his opinions were a more accurate reflection of local beliefs and values than all those town meetings were. I can't quite remember when the light bulb went off, so to speak, but I realized that the newspaper provided the perfect medium and metaphor for organizing my course content and highlighting my pedagogical priorities. So think about it. The front page of the paper showcases all the big, important national and international events. But then as you flip through the paper, you'll see articles and advertisements and editorials that express the wants and needs and beliefs of average readers. You can see what people are buying and watching and reading from the paper. So I decided to structure my entire US history survey course around the motif of the newspaper. So I modeled my syllabus after a newsletter. So from the first day of class, my course looks different. And when I distribute the syllabus to students, I explain about my teaching approach and about this idea that history is more than just the headlines. Then I introduce a presentation style and a visual layout that I maintain for the duration of the semester. Every day, we begin class with a headline slide. So I scour newspaper databases looking for article titles that discuss the topics we'll be covering in class that day. And these stories are typically a range of major events, some lesser known topics, and sometimes they might hint at what we'll be talking about in class that day in a funny way. Spend about 5 minutes at the beginning of each class discussing the headlines as a group. So they're this great icebreaker to get everybody talking and thinking and laughing about the topics of the day. As an instructor, I use the headlines to notify the class about all the big events. But then we flip to the metaphorical second page during lectures and discussions. And I concentrate on telling the stories of people that didn't make the front page. So we're aware of all the major events, but I dedicate the majority of my lectures to telling the stories of women and African Americans and Native Americans and immigrants and the working class and Latinos and Hispanics and all these other groups that have been historically marginalized from the main narrative. To expand upon the newspaper concept, I use a lot of images and advertisements and cartoons in my lectures. One day a week is dedicated to discussion, and typically we would read newspaper articles from the time period, or sometimes magazine articles. Everyone in class had to complete a written newspaper assignment where they read an entire issue of the newspaper from one day in the past, and they summarized the contents for me so they could see what it looked like and how it was organized. So my students were reading and seeing primary sources on a daily basis, meaning real historical sources from the past. But they were less intimidating and more easily understood than a lot of historical documents can be. And the newspaper works perfectly because it's familiar and easily accessible, but at the same time, slightly antiquated and historic. And I love when students tell me, I feel like I'm right there in the past. I'm reading and seeing the same stories that people saw back then. So the newspaper helped my students to feel connected to the past. Now, this might seem like a gimmick, but in all honesty, one of the biggest challenges of a history professor is trying to figure out how to give proper coverage to all these different groups and topics in a really limited amount of time. So through my course motif, through this combination of story titles and newspaper articles and my focus on social and cultural history, my students are learning a more inclusive historical narrative. I'm working to broaden my students' perception of what history is, and I'm teaching history beyond the headlines. Thank you.